Welcome, everyone, to our Facebook Live event. My name is Rob Rowan, and I'm a senior civil rights investigator with the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights. Today, we're presenting a twofold video. The first part deals with redlining. The second portion presents a student art project, both of which are displayed on the third floor of City Hall here in downtown Lincoln. Today, I'm joined by Director of LCHR, Mindy Rush Chipman, Senior Civil Rights Investigator, Chastity Jackson Goodwin, and our moderator for the day, Outreach Coordinator, Francisca Beltran. And a big thank you to our production team, being led by Bo Wolf, who's behind the scenes today. This presentation deals with sensitive issues and is meant to be the beginning of a longer conversation. We hope to be doing more of these in the future, and I hope you'll join us when we do. We'll be playing our presentation, and then we'll be doing a Q&A portion after. We'll keep the entire time today maxed at about 1 hour. Please feel free to put questions in the chat throughout, and we'll address them after the video. Let's begin.
With redlining, people are either familiar with its history and lasting effects, or they don't know anything about it, and perhaps have never even heard the term before. There seems to be little middle ground. The Lincoln Commission on Human Rights is setting out to change that by informing and educating the community about redlining, as well as the continued impact on the Lincoln community. So we'll discuss some of these in greater detail in a little bit. But the Redline map was created in the 1930s for cities across the nation in an effort to shore up and secure home loans for people, mostly white. At the end of World War II, people were buying homes left and right. The Loan Corporation and FHA were securing home loans for people returning from war. The Redline map was utilized so the realtors and mortgage lenders would know where they were assured loans would be backed. Now, in 1954, Brown versus Board of Education supposedly desegregated the nation. Subsequent events showed that just was not the case. Now, in the 1960s, brought about some landmark civil rights legislation, specifically the Fair Housing Act. It established protected classes such as race, color, religion, and national origin. In 1974, the Section 8 program, or Housing Choice Vouchers, was created, as well as adding sex as a protected class. The 1988 amendments established the administrative process and also established disability and familial status as protected classes. In 2015, Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing, or AFFH, and Texas, I'll talk about those more, but those things helped to reinforce desegregation and promoted and demanded protection from discrimination. In 2020, AFFH and Texas were rescinded by the Trump administration, but then reinstated by the Biden administration. So redlining transforms explicit racism into structural racism. Redlining is referred to as predatory exclusion, where homes or loans cannot be acquired within a certain area. Related is what's called reverse redlining, which creates predatory inclusion, where non-white areas are targeted for higher prices and taxes, subprime loans, etc. Through the appraisal process, homes were undervalued to lessen the amount of equity a home could have in it, or the homes were overvalued, thus raising the property taxes, making living in the home too costly for people to stay in their homes. So the HOLC, along with the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, established 4 areas in cities: good, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. This standard was used up until the 1960s. If a home was in the hazardous areas, the Federal Housing Administration would not back any mortgage, loan, or security. And although not explicit or mandated, these effects are felt to this day. In the 1930s, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, along with the Federal Home Loan Bank Board, created maps for most cities that determined what neighborhoods would be the best or worst to secure loans and mortgages in. Referred to as home security maps, they came up with 4 categories: good, still desirable, definitely declining, and hazardous. This standard was used up until the 1960s, and although not mandated or explicit today, the effects are still felt. From the 1930s to the 1960s, the presence of just one black person, unless they were a live-in servant, was enough to render a neighborhood actuarially unsound and thus deemed to be in the definitely declining and/or the hazardous areas. And in these areas, the Federal Housing Administration, or FHA, would not back any loan or security. Between 1930 and 1968, 98% of the loans approved by the federal government went to white applicants. Fewer than 2% of the FHA mortgages went to non-white families in the first 30 years of the FHA's existence. They could only get abusive and predatory rent-to-own, land contract, or subprime lending schemes. Blacks and Latinos were essentially locked out of the wealth-building opportunities that whites had. So in 1968, the Fair Housing Act was signed into law. It's one of the largest civil rights legislations. The act established fair housing law as a law. It established the protected classes of race, color, national origin, and religion. Later, sex was added in 1974, and the 1988 amendments added familial status and disability. Retaliation is also protected, and also established the administrative process, which is what we do at the Commission on Human Rights. After the passage of the Fair Housing Act, there was no power among the federal authorities to enforce it. Much like the other laws, enforcement depended on local civil rights organizations to run the investigations, find evidence, find plaintiffs, etc. And even when they would find evidence of discrimination, there wasn't any actual enforcement, not until 20 years later in 1988. Shortly after the Fair Housing Act was established in 1968, the Nixon administration took over. Nixon was adamant about not taking an active role in desegregation. Although there was a national consensus that housing should be desegregated, there was still a strong push not to enforce the issue. In 1972, Nixon said, "I am convinced that while legal segregation is totally wrong, forced integration of housing or education is just as wrong." So in 2015, there's a United States Supreme Court case that held they analyzed that Congress specifically intended to include disparate impact claims in the Fair Housing Act. This case is what's called Texas Department of Housing and Community Affairs versus Inclusive Communities Project. Now what this did is it established that disparate impact claims are legitimate. There's a difference between disparate impact and disparate treatment. When we have cases of disparate treatment, that's when we have direct evidence of discrimination. Disparate impact is when there's a seemingly neutral policy that discriminates against an entire class of people. As an example, black people have a disproportionately larger amount of felony convictions on their background. So when you have a rental application where you have the box that says check here if you have a felony conviction, that is a seemingly neutral policy, but it has a disparate impact on the black community. Now that rule was rescinded by the Trump administration, but then it was reinforced again by the Biden administration when they took office. So since the Fair Housing Act has a dual purpose, both the elimination of all forms of housing discrimination in residentially segregated communities, affirmatively furthering fair housing is essentially fulfilling the dual purpose of the law. The provision of the 1968 Federal Fair Housing Act signed into law by President Johnson had this in there, and what the Obama administration did is just reinforce it. The law requires that all executive departments and agencies shall administer their programs and activities relating to housing and urban development in a manner affirmatively to further the purposes of the Fair Housing Act, and this includes all programs. Now, this was a rule that was put into place by the Obama administration, and it didn't really get any steam because when the Trump administration took over, they rescinded that. After some injunctive relief, it was reinforced by the Biden administration. A landmark Supreme Court case, Bostock versus Clayton County from 2020, was a landmark United States Supreme Court civil rights case in which the court held that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects employees against discrimination because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Now, this is noteworthy because in most housing cases, the precedents are taken from employment laws and cases and then applied to housing scenarios. This case extends rights to more of the LGBTQ+ community and allows for housing investigations based on sexual orientation or gender identity to move forward with authority from the federal government. and recent guidance from HUD does confirm this. And here are some redline maps from across the country. You'll see them pop up, and these are real. We have them from all over. And there is Lincoln's. This is Lincoln's redline map.
Redlining, reverse redlining, and the related discriminatory behaviors, like blockbusting and steering, is a subject that is daunting to tackle. It's baked into the structure of the U.S. home buying and renting experience. From successfully finding an apartment to rent to single and multifamily home purchases. It's important to note that redlining did and still does have its effects here in Lincoln. And even before the 1930s redlining map was created, there were race clauses in home purchasing deeds. Areas such as Sheridan Boulevard, Piedmont, and Brownbelt had race exclusionary clauses in their purchase agreements. These clauses began around 1916 and continued to the 1970s, even after passing of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. In 1916, Harvey Rathbone was the first developer to introduce race restrictions in the Sheridan Boulevard area. These deeds would state that his developments could only be purchased by those of the Caucasian race, with the only exception being if home buyers had maids or servants that were black. In 1924, another developer named Charles Stewart also had race relations in his deeds. He primarily built in the Piedmont area. During this time, only those of the Caucasian race could purchase a home. The purchase agreements also banned the sale of properties to African Americans, Chinese, or Japanese.
For most of these, the developers used federal funds from the Federal Housing Administration and HOLC. They only got funding for projects that disallowed black homebuyers, renters, and residents. These deeds prohibited anyone other than the white race. As mentioned before, in the 1930s, the government-sponsored Homeowners Loan Corporation introduced the private sector to redlining when it produced color-coded maps of urban areas. Black neighborhoods were marked in red, which were indicated that they were the riskiest areas to insure mortgages. White residents received virtually all loans from the Federal Housing Administration between 1934 and 1962. Federal Housing Administration insurance would not back loans in the declining or hazardous areas. These areas were mostly or solely populated by the black population. Thus, potential homeowners could not get FHA-backed loans to purchase or improve homes. The homes in these areas would thus fall into disrepair or would become just totally dilapidated. The presence of just one black person could deem the area declining or hazardous. So applying the 1930s redline map to Lincoln today. The excluded part of the map that you see was not part of Lincoln at the time.
The Lincoln Commission on Human Rights was founded in 1963 when Mayor Dean Peterson called on Gerald Henderson to lead a Mayor's Council on Human Relations in response to the president's request that cities throughout the country form human rights councils to deal with racial tensions across the country. In 1966, Lincoln voters passed Article 10, an anti-discrimination and human rights amendment to the city's charter, and the Mayor's Council on Human Rights officially became the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights. In 2020, with partnership from the UNL College of Law professor Ryan Sullivan, the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights started the Tenant Assistance Project. TAP has assisted members of the Lincoln community facing eviction during the COVID-19 pandemic. Working with community volunteers and various partner organizations, including the Nebraska State Bar Association and Legal Aid of Nebraska, TAP has prevented over 200 evictions in Lancaster County as of December 2020.
So this is the minority population map of 2018, and it's on top of the poverty map of 2018 as well. As you can see, it's essentially the same map, just with a different color. Now putting up all four maps, what we see almost 100 years later, it's the same map. We can literally see that the redlining effects of black and other people of color is still visible today. Nationally, in 2020, only 46% of black families owned homes compared to white families, which was 75%. And that's a gap that has widened since 1976.
An important court decision that came down was the passage of Shelley versus Kramer in 1948 that ruled racially restrictive covenants as unenforceable. But like most of these kinds of cases, actual enforcement required people to bring cases and suits to court themselves, which costs money that most black people just didn't have. And this is typical. In fact, many laws and acts have been passed in an attempt to desegregate the nation and protect all Americans. Notable laws and acts include the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VIII of Civil Rights Act of 1968, the amendments to Title VIII in 1988, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, the Community Reinvestment Act, Wagner-Steagall Housing Act, Housing and Urban Development Act, the Urban Renewal Act, Housing and Community Development Act, AFFH, and Texas versus Inclusive Communities. The fact that there are so many laws shows that there needs to be a considerable effort to create and maintain fair housing nationwide. Although there are many federal laws, it's the policies of the public that create and maintain this segregation.
There's a significant link between appropriate housing, community involvement, and health. According to the World Health Organization's 2018 Housing and Health Guidelines, improved and fair housing conditions can save lives, prevent disease, increase quality of life, reduce poverty, and even help mitigate climate change. So knowing and understanding this exclusionary practice and its lingering effects is important for all of us to know so that we can right the wrongs that continue to plague our society and community. When we look at how redlining affects us and our neighbors, it's easy to see that it's still of great concern and is a subject that needs to be tackled, studied, and reckoned with.
Public art has the power to educate and effectuate social change. Throughout history, the intersection of art and activism has played a crucial role in social movements against inequity and injustice. Art exhibits that intersect with political activism and social justice causes can be an accessible tool for communication and raising awareness. Having conversations regarding issues such as redlining and other issues surrounding equity are oftentimes difficult, yet necessary. Social justice exhibits that place art and informative displays in non-traditional settings, such as City Hall, can be powerful. The Lincoln Commission on Human Rights aims to promote these conversations and positive change, specifically through the redlining exhibit you just heard about, as well as our social justice art at City Hall project, featuring art created by local high school students. The student artists that are currently exhibited at City Hall are Lincoln High School students, working with their instructor, Michelle Clifford, who created social justice art to raise awareness and raise their voices about issues including food insecurity, juvenile solitary confinement, houselessness, and others. The student artists were asked for artist statements providing information about the social justice art they've created and displayed, and the importance of art in their emerging activism.
Necessities for Children by Alanis Roldan. Living in poverty looks different family to family, but one thing that remains the same is that children are greatly affected. Having kids is expensive. Having to purchase school supplies, shoes, a new coat when they outgrow the old one, a steady home, gloves for winter, or finally, nutritional food. It feels like as soon as you buy one thing, they need another. In this piece, you see children drawing what they need and wish for. Out of 42,000 students in Lincoln Public Schools, 46% live in or below the poverty line. About 500 families are homeless each year. Children perform more effectively when in a comfortable environment, so children living in poverty are 90% more likely to leave school without a diploma. The future of every student is unknown, but the future for kids who live in poverty is one of constant uncertainty. COVID in College by John Sump. This piece is about COVID-19 and its effect on college students in Greek life organizations. 6 fraternity and sorority houses at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln were shut down initially during the COVID-19 pandemic. The artwork here shows Delta Gamma, a sorority that has a house at UNL. This is shown through behind a mask that was supposed to have been worn. It was not worn on bid days for these organizations. Delta Gamma and the other 5 Greek houses violated protocol and held activities or events. This mask isn't just a mask. It's a mask made of red Solo cups, a very prevalent thing in college that's usually linked to partying that had been going on within UNL at that time. The colors seen on the display are very vibrant, and they're there for a reason, as they're the main colors of the Delta Gamma sorority. The blue makes the mask very striking and matches well with the ground, as it's pink and very close to the redness of the cups. This piece was created so people would see it and catch their attention and bring awareness to the spreading threat of COVID in college and our community. A Toast to Your Health in the Spring by Blake Cogan. A toast to return of health in the spring. May winter linger no longer than is welcome. May the air be cleansed and the ill breathe new life. May the fruits of our labors taste less bitter than sweet. May only the most careful of care reach all those who need it. May those who don bandages be kept waiting no longer for the solutions gone scarce with the onset of winter. May the trees never waver in their gifts of pure air. May the dedicated never waver in their task of delivery. May their cause never falter or shift in purpose. May the sleeping awaken to greet each other once more. May the new season bring about a time of old peace as we toast for the return of health in the spring. Boxes by Savannah Miller. Youth rehabilitation centers in Nebraska have a history of inappropriate solitary confinement usage intended for correctional punishment. These centers should have a rehabilitative feel and welcoming environment. Yet this issue at hand is directly contrary to the foundational principles they stake their claims upon. There have been accounts of solitary confinement lasting for days, when the maximum allotment for this should be a few hours. To portray the inappropriate use of solitary confinement, this piece displays a figure as a 2-dimensional figure and a 3-dimensional sculpture. The figure is disheveled and appears to morph into the foundational feeling of the space. Its size and scale are intentionally exaggerated compared to that of a box. The environment to the bottom of the figure is chaotic and sporadic, reflecting the mental mind space created while in solitary confinement in these centers. However, the plain black background directly above the figure represents the stark physical reality of the situation at hand. There are red ties trapping the figure to both illustrate and amplify the feelings evoked. Tears of Glass by Cadence Smith. Paint gray for the clouds of tears, darkness in a barely lit room, wooden slab beds meant to hold the weight of the broken, solitary confinement. The mental aren't broken without a purpose. The trauma is inhumane. The kindred, the sincerity of words, is supposed to shine to those who need it. Youth centers filled with children. We are supposed to be rehabilitative, not correctional. Love of words, kindness from the heart. Let light from the dim bulb shine. Water drain from the overflowed. Darkness seep to the forgiveness of the sun. All under lock and key. Millions of children are being held in youth centers, being contained in solitary confinement for hours, maybe days. They are locked in a room of darkness with only a wooden slab bed and a dim light bulb for company. Today, we in Lincoln, Nebraska, have a youth center where children are not helped or healed, but under surveillance and forgotten. Snap, Problem Solved by Ava Grace Bracken. This piece addresses the difficulties of the pandemic and how they affect Lincoln. The Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, or SNAP, offers monetary assistance that can be very helpful to many families that are struggling during these difficult times. The green statue is a depiction of the golden sower, which sits atop the Capitol building. In this piece, the golden sower is a symbol for Lincoln. The snapping hand symbolizes SNAP and the assistance that it offers to Lincoln.
Here, both the Lincoln Commission on Human Rights Redlining, Designed Inequity, a Local Perspective exhibit, and the Social Justice Art at City Hall exhibit are located on the 3rd floor of the City County building at 555 South 10th Street in downtown Lincoln, Nebraska. We hope these displays will encourage discussions on a variety of social justice issues relevant to our community, particularly now during the COVID-19 public health emergency. These conversations, again, are important not only to raise awareness, but ultimately to effectuate positive change in our community. And thanks for joining us. As you may or may not have noticed, we are experiencing some technical difficulties. So we were fortunate enough, Chastity and I were able to come down to the studio. Our goal is to be able to facilitate some question and answers regarding the redlining presentation and just the social justice artwork that we have displayed on the 3rd floor of City Hall. Do you want to go ahead and talk to each other about some of the questions that we had about the film?
Sure. Do we have any that have come up yet?
That's a great question, because we are not actually having access to community-based questions.
Right.
But I know one of the questions that we had seen earlier is why we chose to display art on the 3rd floor of City Hall, and if we intended to rotate the exhibits or show more pieces. And so I think we're all in agreement that this was a very successful project, and that one of the reasons that we decided to have these art and information exhibits installed in City Hall was really just to raise awareness and raise conversations like what you saw in the video. The Commission on Human Rights, we respond to discrimination that happens in the community, but our ultimate goal is to prevent it. And so by raising awareness and bringing these issues to light and starting conversations, that just furthers the goal of prevention. We have learned that discrimination often happens because folks just might not know some of the rules and regulations. So it's with this art and these informational displays that we hope to get the word out about what people's rights and responsibilities are. We also do other things to get education and outreach. Like, for example, you and Rob are doing a presentation on Monday. We have the Civil Rights Conference, which, by the way, has been rescheduled to October 21st, 2021 at Nebraska Innovation Campus. So with all of the education and outreach efforts we're doing, this educational and art display on the 3rd floor is just an addition to that. Chastity, was there anything surprising that you learned when we were going through the redlining project?
Actually, it was a bit surprising, but I mean, since I'm from Lincoln, to see it all actually displayed and put together, I felt that it was a bit surprising that it's growing, unfortunately, throughout the same area. It's kind of just doing that total spread of the redlining, which I feel is definitely unfortunate for our community. But I think it's very important to be able to visualize it and see it, and how impactful it has been from the beginning of when it actually started to how it's continued to progress, throughout to the present. So that was surprising to me, and hopefully there can be some change with that through education. And I think it's obviously very important for people to know, because I think people don't really realize the significance of the redlining and the negative impacts that it has had on our community as well as communities all over our country. I think it might be something that it's just kind of maybe pushed under the rug, and if you're not directly involved in it, and maybe unfortunately for some people who maybe actually are directly involved, not realizing the impacts and how big it is. So that was surprising to me.
Yeah, I agree with everything that you just said, and I would like to put out there to the community that Investigator Rob Rowan is becoming our in-house subject matter expert on redlining and its effects here locally in Lincoln. Like Chastity said, a lot of us had heard of redlining before. We knew it was something that happened, a long time ago, and that it's theoretically not happening anymore in the lending and housing institutions, but its lasting impact is definitely continues to be felt, and specifically here in Lincoln. So if any of your organizations or groups want to learn more about redlining and specifically the impacts in Lincoln, please reach out. Our email address is lchr@lincoln.ne.gov, and we would be happy to volunteer Investigator Rob Rowan to come to your organization either in person or virtually to do this presentation and to do a Q&A to specifically answer community questions. I think that one of the things that we did want to talk about was just doing a call to action about housing and housing rights here in our community now, dealing with evictions. But Chastity, before I go into that, was there anything that you wanted to add?
Well, someone is asking, is redlining still happening in Lincoln, and what is being done about that?
That's a great question. So the redlining practices really kind of originated in the 1930s, and as you saw in the video, and as Investigator Rowan would more eloquently describe than we could, those overt acts have stopped. Those redlining practices no longer continue. They did happen for a very long time, but they are not currently happening in today's time. However, the result of redlining continues to be felt in our community. So redlining prevented communities of color from purchasing homes and accumulating that generational wealth, and a lot of other effects of the redlining practices that again no longer happen but are still plaguing our community. So I think that was one of our eye-openers is even though redlining's not happening right now, the long-lasting effects are going to be felt for a really long time. And what can be done? Educating community, doing presentations like what we're doing here today to make sure that the community is aware of this practice, and then trying to develop more equitable practices to try to remedy some of the effects of the past redlining. Okay. Did we get another question?
There is another question about the artwork.
Yes, okay. Was it a specific question about the artwork?
No, it's not.
Okay, so the artwork was really just a passion project of outreach coordinator Francisca Beltran and myself. If y'all have ever been to the City County building before, the first floor where we are right now is filled with beautiful art pieces from local artists. However, when you go up to the third floor where our offices are located, bare white walls, more of an institutional feel, but there are many community members that visit the third floor. The mayor's office is there, city attorney, HR, our office. That's where media and press briefings are. And so we thought it was a great opportunity to not only highlight the talented artists in our community, but also try to highlight that art that has more of a human rights, social justice feel. And so that's really where social justice at City Hall came from. We were really lucky to partner with a local art teacher, Michelle Clifford, who teaches at Lincoln High School, and several of her art students were willing to have their art displayed here at City Hall. And the 6 pieces that you see displayed on the third floor right now are very powerful pieces. They, as you saw, they delve into very deep topics like solitary confinement of youth, lack of nutrition, lack of housing, just some very deep topics. And the amazing part about having this art displayed in City Hall right now is you can already hear the conversation starting. In fact, earlier this week I saw 2 community members looking at the art pieces, and we're engaged in a really in-depth conversation about SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, and its vital importance to our community members here in Lincoln, particularly right now during the pandemic. So we're really excited to not only feature this first installation with the redlining exhibit and the student art pieces, but we're planning on rotating the art exhibits on somewhat of a quarterly basis, so that way we can continue these conversations and to highlight issues as they become relevant in our community.
Excellent. The final thing is, I think we're going to be wrapping it up. So if you all have any questions or comments or any other concerns, please feel free to reach out to Lincoln Commission on Human Rights at LCHR at lincoln.ne.gov. You can also visit our the site, humanrights.lincoln.ne.gov, or give us a call for more information at 402-441-7624.
And thank you, Chastity. That was very eloquently wrapped up. I think I just wanted to clarify that any additional questions that you have right now, go ahead and enter those into the Facebook chat box, and Investigator Rob Rowan is monitoring those, and he'll be able to answer right away. You can also leave, you can direct message us through Facebook, or use the contact information that Chastity just provided to ask those follow-up questions. But I think that's probably it for now. Thank you so much for bearing with us through these technical difficulties. I can attest that the city here has been having internet problems all day. It wasn't just our program, but we really appreciate your tuning in and just your interest generally, and we look forward to talking to you more soon.